Hello and welcome. This is the Climate Voices podcast, and I'm your host, Omesa Mukaya, bringing you the deep dives into the realm of the climate crisis. This podcast is an open platform through which we break silos and lead climate action one conversation at a time. We bring together scientists, policymakers, climate activists, and community practitioners to share their positive stories and inspire climate action through demystifying the climate science with the aim of addressing the climate communication barriers that are involved in climate action. Sometimes our well-intentioned efforts to combat climate change end up doing more harm than good, and it becomes a tough nut to crack as adaptation strategies literally backfire. We call this concept maladaptation. And in this episode of the Climate Voices podcast, we are joined by an expert who's going to help us navigate through this concept and learn more about how to move beyond maladaptation. Welcome to the show, Professor Lisa Shikwa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute honor to host you on the show. So I know you are the Professor of Development Geography at the University of Bonn, and I've been involved in what I consider groundbreaking work at the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But will you briefly introduce yourself and take us through some of the work that you've been involved in and what you're involved in at the moment?
Yeah, happy to do so. Well, I guess I started looking at climate change when I was doing my undergraduate degree in environmental science, and I became really interested in sort of the sort of different narratives and priorities that countries have to try to address different priorities like food security and environmental protection. And I came across, as I was studying in Botswana, I came across the veterinary cordon fences that have been set up to separate the cattle from the buffalo to prevent the cattle from having foot and mouth disease. And it became really interesting to me. I became a little bit sort of anti-cattle. And then I came across an article that was about how much methane we would actually avoid if we culled all the cattle as a result of the mad cow disease. That was also a big thing at the time. And it's all these different things connected for me. And I realized that what became interesting was really how are different countries able to tackle the different priorities of development and climate change? And so I eventually realized that the most interesting place for looking at these things is through adaptation to climate change. And adaptation, because there are people who have said that it's a kind of a window of opportunity for rethinking development. And so I thought, well, if we can combine addressing climate change and also rethinking development to make sure that it's more equitable, more fair, this could be a win-win. But to be honest, since then, and that was something I came across written in the early 2000s, adaptation hasn't really been used in a way to rethink development sufficiently. And it, I think, still struggles a lot with injustice. And there's still a lot of implementation of adaptation that is very top-down, and through that process basically avoids dealing with or engaging with local communities, local issues around vulnerability and marginalization, and in that process just reinforces these problems, including being maladaptive. So we actually make people worse off than they were before a project that's supposed to make them better off happened.
Thank you so much. That's a pretty decent intro into what you've been doing and how you got into the space. So, I mean, you've a pretty broad background, and having lived in different parts of the world, addressing climate adaptation, for instance, in South and Central America. From your work, I know you've been in East and West Africa and also in Southeast Asia. So basically, most of the communities or countries which are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, and being at the forefront in addressing this. So my assumption is over time, you've seen the evolution of, climate change adaptation So could you briefly talk about some of the different strategies you've seen in these different countries or cities or communities in terms of addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what I have seen, because I have done work for more policy-facing institutions like Stockholm Environment Institute, and of course also work more in an academic context, and now of course at a university for the last few years, including at Oxford before that. And I think what remains somewhat frustrating, I suppose, is that we're still in this big discussion about what's development and what's adaptation. And so in many instances in the kind of work that I've done, where I've engaged with decision makers, kind of ministers and other kinds of technical people in different countries, or even, in ministries of environment, for example, or other kinds of planning ministries, and also worked very closely with development actors, development corporation funders and NGOs and so on, is that there is, on the one hand, people almost, it's a big rush to make sure that in the funding papers, it's clear this is adaptation to climate change we're funding, and this is development that we're funding. But on the ground, most people recognize that it's almost impossible to distinguish the two. And so I think, the kinds of strategies that I've seen are very often things that try to combine have multiple goals, right? So that we're sort of a win-win approach where we're trying to address current existing kind of climate challenges, but also thinking ahead while also dealing with the development challenges that are there. So, just access to markets for people living in remote villages. Like, what can you do? That their product aren't getting, they're not getting fair share. For example, they're not getting a fair price. So, for example, people who are selling bananas in southern Ethiopia. So a lot of people are selling bananas. There's a middleman that comes, buys the bananas, goes away, because the farmers don't have vehicles, they don't have access to bringing their product to a separate place. So they get, they have to accept the price that the middleman is willing to pay. Farmers are then also stuck in those places if the road floods and the middleman can't arrive to get the bananas, and the bananas spoil. I mean, bananas are a good example. You could think of any other kinds of kind of cash crop, but I think the point is that there are multiple problems at the same time. And the fact that there's this middle person who's getting the biggest share, and the local farmers are basically not getting a lot, but then also the problems of climate, and the fact that they need water to grow these crops and so on. So I think a lot of efforts really try to address all of these things simultaneously. And I worked a lot in a kind of rural setting, working a lot with farmers, and often also farmers are very keen to have irrigation. A lot of the places where I've worked, it's very poor, and so people don't have them. A lot of them have been relying on rain-fed agriculture, so that the rain is the only source of water, essentially. And so small-scale irrigation is often a solution that people are talking about. But to me, these are very short-term, it's very short-term thinking, because actually a lot of the water is also one of these things that is going to be affected by the changing climate. So if we set up an irrigation system, it might be fine for 5 years, but eventually there might not be enough groundwater or whatever, river, whatever the source of the water. And consequently, I've always thought that this is a kind of strategy that basically just keeps farmers in some ways in poverty, because it's kind of a dead-end street. They sort of end up back in a few years in a position where they're still facing lots of challenges. And so my old boss at the International Water Management Institute, he asked, is agriculture a parking lot for the poor? And I think that is, we know that not all agriculture, certainly the large-scale agriculture, commercial agriculture, can be a source of lots of riches, but it isn't an easy job for anybody. I mean, and so I think a lot of thinking around adaptation, I find agriculture is a really helpful way of, it's kind of the best example, and it's also one of the most widespread things that we need to think about in the context of both development and a changing climate. In urban settings, there are other issues, where it's kind of either integrating multiple different kinds of people, making sure that there's housing that isn't going to be flooded. A lot of cities around the world have big slum areas, or even just have flooding in places that are not even slums, but they're just places where people are exposed to flooding because of the way that there's been a lot of development, a lot of concrete, a lot of paving over of other kinds of runoff places, so the water just can't escape. And so here it's also it tends to be around money, who has availability, who has the possibility to even move to a place that's drier or safer. And so issues are really around kind of marginalization of different groups, or exclusion, or other kinds of discrimination can happen. And especially in the big cities around in Asia, you'll see that in Africa, you'll see that in Latin America, where a lot of urban kind of the urban population is composed of a lot of rural people as well. And some of these people are coming for longer time, some other people are coming for shorter times, but they don't have the same networks and the opportunities to actually be integrated in a way that they can actually be able to reduce their risk.
I like that your work has been mostly involved, as you mentioned, again, with the frontline communities, which are impacted the most. And you have all these, ideas spanning from your work in academia and also in research, and towards policy that addresses climate change adaptation. So, from what you've talked, I picked something about development and adaptation, how they can be looked, side by side. But I know you're also involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a lead author of Working Group 2, Chapter 18 on Climate Resilient Development Pathways. So can you briefly talk about what climate resilient development is?
Yeah, climate resilient development is to some extent exactly what I was talking about. It's this kind of idea that you have to bring together both climate change priorities and development priorities, or I should say climate change action priorities, and development priorities, and that these need to be done in sync in a way that doesn't exacerbate climate change, so we don't have lots more CO2 emissions or carbon emissions in general, and that we also don't expose people to the impacts of climate change by, saying, well, the only way to solve the housing crisis and for all these poor people here is to use all this land that nobody else wants and build lots of cheap housing along the river. That wouldn't be a solution. That would not be climate resilient development, because presumably those people would, first of all, if it's cheap housing, they won't be able to, they'll suffer from heat or cold, but heat is a big issue that we worry about in kind of the equator regions. And then, of course, the same is, the risk of flood, for example. And so, we have to think about all of these things at the same time. And it in practice, is probably extremely difficult. It is extremely difficult because we always know that every single decision maker is faced with millions of different priorities. They've got to decide, like, are we trying to build a building here that's going to win an architecture prize so that we get more tourists, so that we can have a better tourist industry and get, all our local vendors getting more people coming and buying their stuff? Are we going to consider, by building a building here that is going to offer also low cost housing as well as offer space for businesses? Or are we going to use this space to build a better hospital that it's more ventilated, where the focus is on maybe heat stroke or heat related issues because our city is becoming hotter and hotter and hotter, for example? This isn't the kind of question that everybody faces, but just to illustrate that there's so many different priorities at the same time. And so then how can you convince these decision makers that actually by looking at climate change and development at the same time, it's kind of like multiple wins? And so that's kind of the idea behind the climate resilient development, is that we have to think about closing development gaps, but we have to do it in a way that keeps emissions down. So we need a kind of a low carbon type of development, but then also because we already have so much climate change, we need to think of this kind of development also needs to integrate risk, so adaptation. And after that, you end up with this process where it's actually this more holistic perspective. And that's what climate resilient development is about.
So as we put effort in, addressing climate change through adaptation, sometimes you have seen cases of, where the efforts or the strategies go wrong. So perhaps I could be interested in knowing, and you've referred to this concept as, maladaptation, where it aggravates the climate risks that are, involved, existing at the moment, or creates, newly unintended consequences where we thought we were solving a crisis, but we end up creating an even worse crisis that ends up impacting the people. So could you briefly try to demystify the concept of maladaptation and what it means in the climate action arena?
Yeah, I mean, maladaptation has actually been a concept that's been around for a really long time. I would say at least the last 20 years. I believe it was already defined in the IPCC's third assessment report that came in 2001. So that means, and that was based on literature that had been published already. So it's a good, has a good 2 decades on it. And the reason is that I think, it was clear that sometimes efforts to address, for example, especially flooding, especially around rivers, have shown to create kind of the wrong type of reaction. So a lot, especially infrastructural protection along rivers, has actually, rather than making people more risk aware, has actually encouraged people to then move right up against the river and say, hey, now this wall is here, whatever other infrastructure, and therefore I'm protected. And this is a phenomenon that disaster risk researchers and practitioners had seen for a while. So it's not necessarily only coming from climate change. So in the 70s, we are already in the disaster risk literature, you could see people talking about this type of approach. But basically, what we notice is that more and more, when we're not planning with a good sense of what the local context is or local priorities or what people really want, then we end up often with a kind of strategy that, well, it might not do anything positive. It might actually make people worse off because it could encourage behavior or situations that would marginalize people that we're trying to help even more. And we see that especially where, and that could mean, it doesn't need to mean outside the country. It could mean somebody coming from the capital, coming to, a community in a rural area, and they just don't have the understanding of what's happening at the local level. And they're not really, really interested in engaging a lot with the people because it's so much work to build up trust and to even figure out who's going to talk, who am I going to talk to, and so on. So instead they say, okay, here we've got this project and here's the funding and we want to do this. And at the end, the people are like, well, actually, now you've made our situation worse. So this can mean like encouraging a type of behavior that means people actually leave and go away. So you kind of have brain drain, you have capacity drain. So people who are able to do certain things previously are no longer there because there's no longer opportunities for them. Or it can create institutional processes that link to behavior. So if you decide we're going to have some sort of crop insurance here, a company comes and says, okay, we're setting up crop insurance. So if your crops fail, here's the kind of payout that you get. And that makes farmers say, oh, well, okay, then actually it doesn't really matter what I do because, all sorts of things can make this crop fail. And therefore I'm going to decide I'm not going to be so worried. I'm not going to consider so much how much rain might be coming. I'm not going to worry so much about my soil moisture and so on. I'm just going to plant. And of course, part of the problem there is that you then not only do farmers not are not behaving in a risk-averse way, but they're also then potentially breaking down the kind of social capital that they had before, where they would go to other farmers and say, hey, what do you know about the season's forecast? And, what's your experience? What do you think? What are you going to plant? And those kinds of relationships are really important for farmers to figure out, what's going on. And that conversation creates a social capital that can also be helpful in other kinds of problems, right? So there are multiple things that can happen at the same time. And the main issue with maladaptation is that we now have about 15 years of empirical examples of adaptation projects being implemented, being studied. And we see that so many of these adaptation projects are not only not working, but they're actually making people worse off because of just all of the things that I mentioned. And so donors are very concerned and they know that they have to address this problem and so are NGOs and so on. But one of the challenges is that it's, these problems are failures, right? They show that the planning process was poor, the participatory engagement was poor and so on. And often those who implement the projects don't really want to share that information. So if it's an NGO receiving funding, external funding, they don't necessarily want to go around and advertise that, oh, hey, we screwed up here and we don't really here's what seems to have gone wrong. So for somebody coming from outside to try to understand why is maladaptation happening, we have a limited amount of kind of knowledge that we can draw on, because it's kind of, you want to hide and not share this kind of failure information. So I think one of the first steps is to encourage organizations to share that kind of information so that we can figure out and learn a bit more and figure out if there's some way that we can prevent this from happening. Because most maladaptation is stuff that we are from projects, and we can only really see it with hindsight and say, 2 years out, this project obviously was maladaptive and made people worse off. It's very difficult to say in the middle of the project, this one looks like it's going badly, because you still have time to save it, but also because it's just, you don't have the final outcomes yet, right? So you can't really evaluate whether it's failed or not.
Thank you so much for breaking that down to what I consider an understandable language for whoever hasn't gotten an opportunity to understand what maladaptation is. So you mentioned that sometimes even planning can lead to maladaptation, or poor planning for that matter. So I'm kind of interested in knowing why maladaptation is happening, despite you've said it goes back 15 years where studies have been focusing on what exactly maladaptation is, but it still keeps happening. And as the climate keeps changing and temperatures keep rising, we tend to be planning, for example, for what happens when we get to 1.5, what happens if the scenario takes us to 4 degrees. So that kind of planning, and the temperatures keep rising spontaneously and you don't know what happens next, and sometimes the actions that we put in place that we're going to do end up being maladaptive. So what are some of the these structures that are cultivating maladaptation, and why is it still thriving despite all this literature and all this knowledge about maladaptation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest reasons is that most of the funding doesn't go down to the local level. So external actors are the ones driving adaptation projects. This is now shifting slightly because there's this new concept called locally led adaptation, which is really being pushed. It has a whole set of principles with it. And most of the donors have now signed up to this concept of locally led adaptation, but it has to be not just in name, right? It has to actually be locally led. So that means it means both management and implementation of projects on a local level. But the reason it's happening otherwise is because most of the money doesn't come on go to the local level. I mean, at the moment, there's about 1% of climate finance that goes down to the local level. So most of the money is still sitting and being managed by external actors, and they just don't have that local knowledge. Part of the problem is, I would argue, that there's certain kinds of adaptation strategies that seem to be more popular that are also more problematic. So one of the big ones is infrastructure. Everything, protecting coastal settlements, building some kind of bridge, walls, all sorts of things like that. They look good, right? Like that's a kind of thing that a country would like to have. And also the regional development banks, like the African Development Bank and especially the Asian Development Bank, they're very keen to fund that kind of stuff because it's like big scale things, but they're totally inflexible. I mean, once you constructed this enormous wall to protect a coastal settlement, how it's not made out of Lego. So you're going to be basically, you're stuck with it there. So you have to make sure that you've done it right. But often these processes are so lengthy, and then, the planning process starts cutting corners. But I mean, we have so many examples where actually there's been a miscalculation, and we end up, not only maybe that place itself has been protected, but the place further down the coast is actually receiving a lot more problems now. So that it shifts kind of coastal erosion further down the coastline, or it shifts all sorts of problems. The example that I tend to use over and over again is from Fiji, where a wall was built to protect a coastal settlement, and they didn't consider the fact that actually it also rains sometimes, and therefore the rainwater has to somehow drain. And so the rainwater wasn't draining back into the ocean, and they were having flooding on the inside, or, and I just think that, you can't necessarily say that all infrastructural projects, adaptation projects, are bad, but so many of the maladaptation examples stem from infrastructure. So I think we could say that infrastructure projects should really consider, take a closer look. And that's mainly because it's so flexible, right? So when the other kinds of projects, I think, are when they're slightly more flexible, then it offers, opportunity to fix them a little bit easier. And, so if farmers get very, very thirsty crops or are advised to plant something that's very, very thirsty and there's no market for it, well, okay, the next season, or at least in a couple of seasons, you can change things. Although if it's fruit trees, for example, that time as well to grow. So, but I think that the most challenging thing is that some of these, what we see as maladaptation, maladaptive strategies, actually undermine opportunities for adaptation in the future. So it's not just that, oh, this was a bad outcome, but actually all the opportunities, that the chances that we have for it to be good in the future, for us to fix the problem, have been thrown out the window. So when people, on a smaller scale, you can think of farmers who sell off their livestock during drought and then end up with no capital at all left because the drought is so prolonged. And they end up then what do? They need the cash to be able to buy food, because nothing is growing, and they don't have any animals left. And then at the end there's nothing, right? And so that is a very kind of where do the farmers go? Then they've basically driven themselves into a poverty trap of sorts. And you can think of that at different kinds of scales.
So certainly the food systems or agriculture is one sector that is mostly impacted by climate change, and I'm assuming there are a couple of maladaptive strategies or things that people put in place, but they end up backfiring. Sometimes we've seen that you mentioned corporations and industrial agriculture taking place, but for example, in the global south, agriculture is the mainstay of most economies. Like my country, agriculture is the mainstay of Kenya's economy, and I can say Africa's economy. Actually, most of the people are small-scale farmers who are actually greatly impacted by the impacts of climate change. But in the name of trying to address food insecurity, we have seen people or development funders or donors coming in with promises of addressing that through investing more into industrial farming. And one can argue that sometimes the aggravated use of agrochemicals, and I saw someone argue somewhere that we could also try to embrace more ecosystem-based adaptation or kind of agriculture, and the yields go down. So which actually, again, because you're trying to solve one crisis, but it impacts production, and it's not solving the problem at all. So in the agriculture system, or in trying to solve the food crisis, so maladaptation, it's what I'm reading from this, it could go either way. So is that something that maybe you've, through your literature, I know you have written a paper on maladaptation, how when, adaptation goes wrong or backfires. So is that something that you might want to, try to talk about, whether, trying to look at the ecosystem way and trying to look at the industrial way, sometimes either way something goes wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you could also broaden it to say, some efforts to try to capture carbon emissions, for example, to sequester carbon through planting forests, also have a negative impact. There's a project that from Cambodia that's quite well documented, that where there was a kind of a local forest that people were using the resources and collecting lots of different things and selling them, and that was kind of their livelihood. And then somebody decided, we're going to have a big carbon sink here, and we're going to cut down this local forest, and we're going to plant acacia trees instead, so that we can suck up the carbon. But it completely excluded these people, who the local people no longer had any access, or access maybe, but there was nothing to do there, because the resources that they had been collecting before were no longer there. And certainly those kinds of project problems we see. So I would say, this is kind of then we can start getting into kind of talking more about development problems, because the irony with these maladaptation, it's like I said, it's been around for a while, but it's sort of recently that everybody's really excited and concerned about it. but actually we have maldevelopment examples going back for, decades, right? And we know that so many interventions that have happened, since the 1950s have actually been completely have just led to new problems, beginning essentially with when, countries decided that they were going to leave the colonies behind. I mean, that doesn't mean that colonization was left behind. And, the tensions, the problems, the resource conflicts and so on. I mean, these are just basically handed to the countries through this process of decolonizing. And I think that we should have learned much better lessons to understand that if we also lead these climate projects through and adaptation projects through the same channels, the same institutions, the same structures as development projects, we will inevitably have the same kinds of problems where, and you can describe that it's kind of externalities, but that makes it sound like it's something benign. I mean, of course, it's not at all. It's really problematic. We shouldn't have any kinds of projects that end up doing harm to communities external or, of course, internally. But I mean, what we're looking at often is these kinds of trade-offs. Again, that expression sounds like it's okay, like we can accept it, but we shouldn't accept these kinds of things. And so, I think we have to take much more seriously the knock-on impact that all of these kinds of interventions can have, and potentially, and not to sound like I'm a cheerleader for this, because I think it also has its limitations, but potentially this is where the locally led concept, the locally led adaptation can fill a gap, because it can not only allow for this sort of, the local management and this ownership and avoidance of, or projects that can contextualize the vulnerability, that can understands what's going on, but also hopefully would avoid these problems where actually the local people have a certain kind of aspiration for what their future should look like. And these external projects will come in and they will not at all care or even, do things that will go against these kinds of aspirations. And so I don't think there's a single kind of silver bullet, of course, but I think it's important to, we do have some tools at our disposal for how to avoid projects. And the other thing I would say is, I don't think there's a lot of examples of successful adaptation around. I mean, we are very, I think that's one of the big challenges, is how to define successful adaptation. But the project that I tend to use is a very local, small scale project that was implemented by a development organization in Bangladesh, where they noticed that when there was a lot of flooding, the chickens were dying because chickens can't swim. And so they decided instead to give people duck eggs and say, here, why don't you instead raise ducks? Because when it floods, ducks can swim. And it was really, really, really successful because people were able to accept the meat, and now kind of the local restaurants have even taken on, it's replaced on the menus, it's no longer chicken, now it's duck specialties. And this has happened over the course of a long kind of several years. I mean, this is kind of one of the original projects that I ever heard about. And so I would say it's probably more than 15 years since it was implemented. But I think it's the reason behind the success is probably because it was very, very small scale intervention, right? And of one specific thing, it could have gone very wrong, though, if people had said, oh, we don't like the taste of duck meat, we don't like how to take care of the ducks, they smell bad, I don't know what. But, there could be a lot of factors where that had, maybe that people, it could have led to it going wrong. But in this case, it was successful. So it just also goes to show that it's really hard to know what's going to work and what's going to fail badly.
Yeah, I love the locally led initiatives example and, the chicken and ducks example. So what I'm reading from your, this conversation is that maladaptation could span, from infrastructure to planning and to sometimes, is it behavioral or psychological, something like that. So knowing all these facts or all this information that we have, how can we steer, clear of these maladaptation pitfalls going forward? Because the climate, is changing. It's here with us, and the impacts are happening. People are suffering, and people are being impacted. So how can we steer off, these pitfalls going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what everybody is trying to figure out. So I would say that until now, the research has been really kind of repetitive. Like we kind of hit up against the same conclusion over and over, that maladaptation happens. And this is, and we now have a sense of why it happens. But what we basically concluded is that we only know with hindsight. We can only see after a while. And that's because adaptation projects, adaptation is a process. And climate change is a process, and it's continuously happening. So at what point do you draw the line and say, okay, now we're going to assess whether this is successful or not? I mean, presumably most of these efforts, the evidence will only be clear in 5 to 10, maybe even longer, if you've actually had positive impact. 5 to 10 years, that is. So I think, to avoid maladaptation, therefore, we need to look at the kinds of things that seem to be driving it, and avoid them in the beginning, in the planning phase, rather than kind of throughout trying to sort of keep, do this evaluation as we're going along and say, or the monitoring process, like, okay, here, oh, this is a sign, because it isn't really like there's like specific indicators that happen in real time that where we can say, oh, this is a maladaptation sign, So the things that we found in looking at other projects are that, first of all, this local context, bringing the local knowledge, integrating local actors. That's really, really critical. Making sure that projects don't constantly get implemented by using the same organizations over and over again. And we see this like, donors come into a country, that government has, certain people they want to work with, or the donors already have existing relations with NGOs or other kinds of grassroots organizations. And they don't really want to go through the trouble of building new relations and writing new memorandums of understanding. And so they say, well, we're going to work with these guys again. And so that actually creates marginalization of other groups. So, to vary and to avoid making sure that you're not actually working constantly with these local elites, that you're actually working with the people who need the most attention. The other thing that we see over and over again is how development agencies or actors, will use kind of like blueprints, like, oh, this was an adaptation project that we designed for, Vietnam. Now we're going to apply it in Zambia, without, again, really considering the local differences, the local context. And then I think most importantly, and this is probably the most difficult thing, is really understanding what is exactly adaptation. Like, what do we mean when we say we're going to implement an adaptation project? Is it like early warning systems? Is it, better climate information? Is it, making sure that every single household is prepared for a disaster? Is it about climate education in schools? Is it about, rethinking, where agriculture, the role of agriculture in a country's economy? Probably it's all of those things. So, but very often we'll see that projects will focus only on one or two, or maybe, and not really consider the breadth of adaptation. And so as a result, what the outcome is will depend on how we define it. So if we're looking for, early warning systems and say, this is adaptation, we're going to set up early warning systems or risk maps everywhere around, an area. And then the way that we try to assess success is by saying, people are now less vulnerable to floods or whatever. Yeah, well, not really, because that isn't the entirety of what you need to do. So those are just small steps in this bigger puzzle of adaptation. So I think, to me, these are the kinds of things that we need to do. And especially for the last point, this is where countries are now in big discussions, because within the context of the Paris Agreement, there is this global goal on adaptation that has to be defined. And countries are really struggling to try to figure out what exactly is adaptation in this context. So we're in a kind of an exciting moment in a way. But I think, as you said in the beginning, the time is ticking, right? And so we don't have the opportunity to sit around and wait too much. And that's also really problematic for maladaptation, because we also don't have the time really to engage and build trust and, develop the local context and so on, because, that takes time. So this might be another reason why the locally led approach is preferable, because you can skip those steps, because the local people will be implementing the projects and they understand what's going on as well. So, but again, I don't want to romanticize one approach, because I know there's a history of nothing is perfect in the development world.
Yeah. Thank you so much for, breaking that up. And I know we're coming to almost the end of this. We have 2 minutes left. So because I realize it's a broad topic, and you're good at talking about it, you could talk about it all day. So in less than 2 minutes, do you see any optimism about the global capacity to adapt or to avoid maladaptation? Because I know, again, we impacted differently, in different parts of the world. So as we come to the conclusion of this.
Yeah, thanks. I think I do feel optimistic in the sense that it's almost like we've had a breakthrough in the last few years on understanding kind of these barriers and acceptance and acknowledgement of the barriers facing adaptation. And I think that 2 years ago, we published a paper that received a lot of traction among the donor community. And it was really rewarding to see that they acknowledged that there were these problems that were creating more vulnerability rather than reducing it. And they really want to figure out how to address them. And I should also say that just given the number of invitations I've received by donor actors to talk about maladaptation, they're really taking this seriously. And so I think that is for me very, very positive. But yeah, we're in a crisis, and we know that also not only are these kind of barriers to adaptation, but we also have limits. So adaptation won't be effective once we hit 1.5 and beyond. And that's the real problem is, how do we manage to get these things going before it's too late, before people have fallen into that poverty trap, and before things are impossible to fix. And I do worry a lot about that, but to be optimistic about it, at least I think we're on the right track for addressing the problems that adaptation has been facing for the last 15, maybe 20 years. So I suppose that's the good part about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's been really amazing having you share your insights and thoughts about this topic that has been in the discussions, and people have been wondering what's happening and how we can do it. So I really appreciate your time being here to share some of your insights. And I know there are a number of people will benefit from your insights on this. So do you have any closing remarks that you want to share to our listeners?
I think maybe just that it's important to understand, kind of, maybe read up about the different kinds of types of adaptation. And there's a lot of really accessible literature. It's not all just academic literature. There's, a lot of NGOs work on adaptation, and especially community-based adaptation. And also, if you're interested, you can find this locally led adaptation, these principles of locally led adaptation. All of this is online, and just have to Google locally led adaptation, and you should be able to find it. So I guess that's just to say, if you want to learn more, there are lots of very accessible resources out there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also I encourage everyone to go read your papers, and because you have written more on this concept. Yeah, so thank you so much for being here and for sharing this. I really appreciate it. And it was an amazing conversation. I hope we can do this sometime again soon. So thanks everyone for tuning in. This is the Climate Voices podcast, and I'm your host, Omesa Mokaya.